On a frozen January morning in 1959, two high school sweethearts drove into the Montana darkness for what should have been an ordinary date. By sunrise, their bodies would be discovered in ways that would haunt a small town for over 6 decades. What happened on that lonely road outside Great Falls would become one of the coldest cases in American history, until a technology that didn't exist in their lifetime finally whispered their killer's name. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the case of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. Break time equals 0. 5S// a story of silence, errors, and consequences. Now let's begin. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to a different America. Picture a time when teenagers could drive country roads at night without fear, when small towns knew their neighbors by name, and when leaving your door unlocked wasn't considered reckless. The late 1950s were winding down, and in Great Falls, Montana, life moved at the gentle pace of a place where everyone seemed connected by just 1 or 2 degrees of separation. But something was stirring beneath that surface calm, something that would shatter the innocence of an entire community and leave questions echoing through generations. Tonight, we're going to explore a story that begins with young love and ends with science that sounds like fiction. We'll walk through this slowly, carefully, the way these stories deserve to be told. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about Lloyd and Patricia, 2 kids who never got the chance to grow old. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Great Falls sits at the edge of the Great Plains, where Montana begins its slow climb toward the Rocky Mountains. In January of 1959, it was a town of about 50,000 people, built around Malmstrom Air Force Base and the industries that fed off military presence. The winters were brutal. Temperatures could drop well below 0, and the wind that swept across those plains didn't just chill you. It cut straight through to the bone. Lloyd Dwayne Bogle was 18 years old that winter. He'd been born and raised in Great Falls, the kind of kid who seemed to embody everything wholesome about small-town America. He had dark hair, an easy smile, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was. Lloyd was an airman, stationed at Malmstrom, following a path that thousands of young men walked in those days, serving his country, building a future, dreaming about what came next. Patricia Kalitsky was 16. Friends called her Patty. She had that fresh-faced beauty you see in old yearbook photos, the kind that makes you pause and think about all the life that should have stretched out ahead. She was a junior at Great Falls High School, navigating that delicate space between childhood and whatever adulthood might bring. She worked part-time at a local store, saved her money, and like most teenagers, thought about the future in ways both thrilling and terrifying. Lloyd and Patty had been seeing each other for a while. Not formally engaged, not promised to one another in any official way, but clearly more than casual. They were in that stage where everything feels possible, where a car ride can be an adventure and a shared milkshake can feel like the most important moment in the world. Their relationship was the kind that parents approved of, wholesome, innocent, appropriate for the times. Tuesday, January 6th, 1959, started like any other winter day. School, work, the ordinary rhythms of life in a military town. Lloyd had the evening free. Patty was available. They made plans the way young couples did then. A simple decision to spend time together, to drive around, maybe grab something to eat, just be in each other's company. Around 8 that evening, Lloyd picked Patty up in his car. Witnesses would later remember seeing them, looking happy, relaxed, just 2 kids enjoying a winter night. They drove through town, perhaps stopped somewhere for a while, then headed out toward the edges of Great Falls, where the streets gave way to rural roads and the lights of town faded into vast Montana darkness. There was a spot locals knew about, a lover's lane of sorts, though that phrase makes it sound more romantic than it was. Really, it was just a turnout along a dirt road near the Sun River, a place where couples could park and talk without the whole town watching. In a community where everyone knew everyone, privacy was a precious commodity. So when Lloyd turned onto that isolated stretch of Vineyard Road, he and Patty were doing what countless other young couples had done, finding a quiet moment away from prying eyes. The temperature that night hovered around 0 degrees. The kind of cold that makes your breath freeze in the air, that turns car engines stubborn and makes metal surfaces dangerous to touch with bare skin. But inside a running car with the heater going, 2 people could stay warm enough. They could talk, listen to the radio, watch their breath fog the windows, and forget about the cold pressing in from every direction. Sometime during those dark hours, something went terribly wrong. The details of what happened remain partially shrouded, even now, after everything that eventually came to light. What we know is that violence entered that car. Sudden, brutal violence that gave Lloyd and Patty no real chance to escape or defend themselves. The attack was swift and savage, carried out by someone who either planned this carefully or acted on impulse with terrifying efficiency. Lloyd was found in the front seat of his car the next morning, still behind the wheel. He'd been shot in the head, killed almost instantly. The crime scene suggested he'd been taken by surprise, that death had come before he could react or resist. His body remained in the vehicle, discovered when daylight brought the first people down that rural road. Patty's fate was different, and somehow even more disturbing. Her body was found a short distance away, in an area near the road. She'd been removed from the car, subjected to a physical assault that went beyond the immediate violence. The evidence told investigators that she'd experienced something no person should ever endure. Then she too had been killed. Her life ended in that frozen darkness, far from anyone who might have heard or helped. When the bodies were discovered that Wednesday morning, January 7th, the news rippled through Great Falls like a shockwave. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in their town. Not to kids like Lloyd and Patty. The high school went into a kind of collective mourning. The air base tightened its sense of community. Parents looked at their own teenagers differently, suddenly aware of vulnerabilities they'd never fully considered. The Great Falls Police Department and the Cascade County Sheriff's Office immediately launched what would become one of the most extensive investigations in Montana history. Detectives worked the scene for hours, cataloging every piece of evidence they could find. They took photographs, made measurements, collected samples of everything that might prove relevant. They interviewed friends, family members, classmates, fellow airmen, anyone who might have seen Lloyd and Patty that night or who might know something useful. What they found was frustratingly limited. There were no witnesses to the actual crime. The location was isolated enough that someone could commit murder without being seen or heard. The cold weather meant fewer people were out driving rural roads at night. Whoever had done this had either gotten incredibly lucky or had chosen their moment with calculated precision. Still, the investigators had evidence. Physical evidence from the scene, biological evidence from the victims. In 1959, forensic science was advancing but still primitive by modern standards. DNA analysis didn't exist. Fingerprinting was useful but required having prints on file to compare. Blood typing could narrow things down but couldn't definitively identify individuals. The tools available to these dedicated detectives were limited, and they knew it. They developed a profile such as it was. The killer was likely someone local or at least familiar with the area. Someone who knew about that lover's lane, who understood the routines and patterns of the community. The violence suggested either rage or calculation, possibly both. The fact that Patty had been moved from the car indicated a certain amount of physical capability and a disturbing willingness to spend time at the scene even after committing murder. Tips came in by the dozens, then hundreds. Everyone in Great Falls seemed to have a theory or a suspicion. Investigators followed every lead they could, interviewing suspects, checking alibis, trying to piece together a narrative that made sense. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and the case remained unsolved. Lloyd's family grieved in private, trying to make sense of a loss that had no sense to make. Patty's family did the same, carrying a burden that grew heavier with time rather than lighter. The town eventually returned to its routines, but something had changed. An innocence had been lost. A shadow had been cast that wouldn't fully lift. The investigation into the deaths of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky didn't just go cold. It froze solid and stayed that way for decades. But that doesn't mean it was forgotten. In the years that followed that terrible January night, detectives continued to work the case whenever new leads emerged, or whenever advances in forensic science offered fresh possibilities. By the early 1960s, the case file had grown thick with reports, interviews, and dead ends. Cascade County Sheriff's Department kept it active, though resources were limited and other crimes demanded attention. Detective work in that era required patience and persistence, endless hours of following threads that usually led nowhere. Without the digital databases and communication networks that would come later, tracking suspects across state lines or connecting seemingly unrelated crimes was extraordinarily difficult. Still, certain detectives became obsessed with the case. They'd pull the file during slow periods, review the evidence again, make new calls to old witnesses. They interviewed hundreds of people over the years. Every airman who'd been stationed at Malmstrom in January of '59 came under scrutiny at some point. Local men with histories of violence or unusual behavior found themselves questioned and re-questioned. Some investigators developed pet theories they'd pursue for years before finally admitting the trail had gone completely cold. The physical evidence remained in storage, carefully preserved but essentially useless with the technology of the time. Blood samples, hair samples, fibers, all the biological material that might one day prove crucial sat in evidence rooms, waiting for science to catch up to justice. The detectives who'd worked the original case began to retire. Then they began to die. The file was passed from one generation of law enforcement to the next, each inheritor hoping they might be the one to finally solve it. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, forensic science made steady advances. Blood typing became more sophisticated. Fingerprint analysis improved. But the big breakthrough, DNA analysis, remained just beyond reach. The technique was developed in the mid-80s, but it took years before it became reliable enough for forensic use and years more before it became common in criminal investigations. By the 1990s, DNA testing had revolutionized law enforcement. Cold cases across America were being reopened and solved as old evidence was re-examined with new technology. The Bogle-Kalitsky case was among those reviewed. In 2005, 46 years after the murders, detectives submitted evidence for DNA analysis, hoping that preserved samples might finally yield answers. The results came back clear. The lab had successfully developed a DNA profile from evidence collected at the crime scene. It was a male profile, presumably belonging to the killer. This was huge. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough investigators had been hoping for. Finally, after nearly 5 decades, they had a genetic fingerprint of the person who'd murdered Lloyd and Patty. But there was a problem. The profile didn't match anyone in the FBI's combined DNA index system, known as CODIS. This database contained DNA profiles from convicted offenders across the United States, and it had helped solve thousands of crimes. But it only worked if the perpetrator was already in the system. Whoever had killed Lloyd and Patty either had never been convicted of another crime, or had died before DNA collection became standard, or had somehow avoided being entered into the database. So the case remained unsolved, but now with a crucial difference. Investigators knew exactly what they were looking for: a specific genetic signature. They just had to find the person it belonged to. Detective Sergeant John Cadner inherited the case in 2012. He was with the Cascade County Sheriff's Office, a thorough investigator with a reputation for persistence. When he first opened that decades-old file, he found himself looking at photographs of 2 kids who'd been dead longer than he'd been alive. Something about the case grabbed him. Maybe it was the innocence of the victims, maybe it was the frustration visible in decades of failed investigation, or maybe it was simply the challenge of it. This impossible puzzle that had defeated everyone who'd tried to solve it. Cadner began re-interviewing people, tracking down witnesses who'd been young adults in 1959 and were now elderly, if they were still alive at all. He reviewed every inch of the case file, looking for details previous investigators might have missed or connections that might only become apparent with the benefit of hindsight. He became the latest detective to develop an obsession with Lloyd and Patty, joining a long line of law enforcement officers who'd carried their case through the years. By 2017, Cadner knew he had good DNA evidence but no way to connect it to a specific person. The killer's profile sat in the database, pristine and useless, a genetic signature without a name attached. If the perpetrator had committed crimes after DNA collection became routine, they would have been caught years ago. That suggested either someone who'd stopped defending, which was unlikely given the violence of the initial crime, or someone who'd died. Cadner began to consider a possibility that was just emerging in law enforcement circles. What if they could use DNA databases that weren't designed for criminal investigation? What if they could use the same technology that helped adoptees find biological parents and curious people trace their ancestry? The idea of forensic genealogy was still controversial. It raised privacy questions and legal concerns. But it had worked. In April of 2018, investigators in California used exactly this technique to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial offender who'd evaded capture for decades. They'd uploaded crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, found distant genetic relatives, and then used traditional genealogical research to narrow down possible suspects. Cadner saw the Golden State Killer case unfold and realized it might be the answer he'd been searching for. If it could work for California, why not Montana? Why not Lloyd and Patty, who'd been waiting for justice even longer? He began the process of getting approval to use this new technique. It required coordination between his department, the forensic lab, and genealogy experts who understood how to navigate these databases. There were legal considerations to work through, protocols to establish, permissions to obtain. But by late 2018, Cadner had assembled a team and was ready to try something that had never been done before in Montana. The DNA profile from the crime scene was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where users voluntarily shared their genetic information to find relatives. The system searched for matches, people whose DNA showed they were related to the unknown killer. The first results came back showing several distant cousins, people who shared a common ancestor with the perpetrator somewhere back in their family trees. This was where traditional detective work met cutting-edge science. Genealogists began building family trees, working backward from the distant cousins to find common ancestors, then forward again to identify all the descendants of those ancestors. They were looking for men who would have been the right age in 1959, who had some connection to Great Falls, who fit the general profile investigators had developed over decades of investigation. The work was painstaking. Each branch of each family tree had to be thoroughly researched. Birth records, death records, marriage records, census data, all the documentary evidence of people's lives had to be traced and verified. The team worked for months, slowly narrowing down possibilities, eliminating candidates, focusing their investigation. And then, gradually, a name began to emerge. A man who fit every criterion. A man who'd been in Great Falls in January of 1959. A man who'd had the opportunity and, as more research revealed, possibly the motive. Kenneth Gould. Kenneth Gould had been dead for 9 years when genetic genealogy finally identified him as the likely killer of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. He'd passed away in 2007, taking whatever secrets he'd carried to his grave. But death doesn't prevent justice anymore. Not in an age where DNA can speak for the silent and science can reach back through decades to touch the past. Detective Cadner and his team had a name, but a name wasn't enough. They needed confirmation. Direct genetic evidence linking Kenneth Gould specifically to the crime scene. The problem was obvious. You can't exactly ask a dead man for a DNA sample. But Gould had children. His family was still alive, still in the area. After 60 years, after all the pain and mystery, investigators found themselves in the delicate position of approaching a family and asking them to help prove their father was a murderer. Cadner handled it carefully. He contacted Gould's children and explained, as gently as possible, what the investigation had uncovered. He told them about the genetic genealogy, about the decades of investigation, about Lloyd and Patty and the terrible night in 1959. He asked if they'd be willing to provide DNA samples, not to prove their own involvement. They'd all been children or not yet born when the murders occurred, but to help confirm or eliminate their father as a suspect. To their credit, Gould's children agreed. They wanted the truth, whatever it might be. They provided DNA samples voluntarily, knowing full well what the results might reveal about a man they'd called father. The samples went to the lab. Geneticists compared the DNA from Gould's children to the DNA profile from the crime scene. They were looking for markers that would indicate paternal relationship, genetic signatures passed from father to child. The analysis took time, required multiple verifications, had to meet the highest scientific standards because everyone involved knew how important this was. The results came back definitive. Kenneth Gould was the biological source of the DNA found at the crime scene. The genetic evidence was overwhelming, impossible to explain away. After 60 years, after hundreds of investigators, after thousands of hours of police work, after all the false leads and dead ends and frustrated hopes, the mystery was finally solved. Kenneth Gould had murdered Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. So who was Kenneth Gould? What kind of man had he been? How had he escaped suspicion for so long? Digging into Gould's background revealed a complicated picture. In January of 1959, he'd been 25 years old. Older than Lloyd, significantly older than Patty. He was a local man, someone who knew Great Falls and the surrounding area. He'd lived what appeared to be a relatively normal life after the murders. Married, had children, held jobs, participated in his community. To all outward appearances, he'd been an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But investigators uncovered some disturbing details as they dug deeper. Gould had a history, though not one that had flagged him as a serious suspect during the original investigation. There were questions about his behavior, patterns that became more significant in retrospect. Friends and acquaintances, when re-interviewed with the benefit of hindsight, remembered things that seemed off, moments when Gould's behavior had been strange or his reactions to the murders had seemed wrong somehow. More significantly, investigators discovered that Gould had actually been interviewed early in the investigation. He'd been one of hundreds of local men questioned in the desperate search for Lloyd and Patty's killer. But whatever he'd told detectives in 1959 had been enough to move him down the list of suspects. Maybe he'd had an alibi, or maybe he'd simply been convincing in his denials. Without physical evidence to contradict him, without DNA testing to prove he was lying, he'd slipped through. It's a haunting thought that the killer was identified early on, that he sat across from detectives and successfully lied his way out of suspicion, then went on to live decades more of life while Lloyd and Patty remained frozen at 18 and 16 forever. The question of motive remained somewhat murky. Gould had known Patty at least casually. Some reports suggested there might have been some prior interaction, perhaps unwanted attention on his part. But the exact reason why he'd committed such violence on that January night might never be fully understood. Some things died with Kenneth Gould, and no amount of scientific advancement can resurrect the thoughts and motivations of a dead man. What the evidence did make clear was that this hadn't been a random attack by a stranger passing through. This was a local man who knew the area, who knew about that lover's lane, who understood when and where young couples went for privacy. Whether he'd followed Lloyd and Patty specifically or had simply been hunting that night, waiting for any vulnerable couple, remained an open question. In May of 2019, Detective Cadner held a press conference. After 60 years of silence, after generations of grief and frustration, he stood before cameras and reporters and announced that the murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky had been solved. He explained the genetic genealogy process, the years of work, the confirmation through DNA testing. He named Kenneth Gould as the perpetrator. For the families who'd waited so long, the announcement brought complicated emotions. Justice had finally arrived, but it came without the satisfaction of a trial, without the chance to confront the killer in court, without any possibility of legal punishment. Gould had died peacefully at age 79, never having spent a single day in prison for what he'd done, never having been publicly accused or forced to answer for his crimes. Some of Lloyd's family members were still alive to hear the news. They'd lived their entire lives under the shadow of his murder, never knowing who'd stolen him from them or why. Now, in their old age, they finally had answers, though the answers came too late for closure in any traditional sense. Patty's family, too, learned the truth after decades of uncertainty. For them, the knowledge that Gould had lived a full life while their daughter had been denied hers added another layer of injustice to an already unbearable situation. But at least they knew. At least the question that had haunted them for 60 years had finally been answered. The Great Falls community, many members now far too young to remember the original crime, received the news with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The case had become a kind of local legend, one of those mysteries that defined a place in subtle ways. Solving it after so long felt both cathartic and melancholy. The resolution of the Bogle-Kalitsky case stands as one of the oldest murders ever solved through genetic genealogy. It demonstrated the power of new technology to reach back through time, to give voice to the silenced, to bring a kind of justice even when traditional justice is no longer possible. But the case also raises profound questions about memory, time, and the nature of justice itself. What does it mean to solve a crime when everyone directly involved is gone? Lloyd Bogle would have been in his late 70s if he'd lived. Patricia Kalitsky would have been in her mid-70s. Kenneth Gould died at 79, having lived a full life that his victims were denied. The detectives who worked the original investigation have all passed away. The witnesses, the friends, the family members who were young adults in 1959 are now elderly or gone. The world that Lloyd and Patty inhabited, that buttoned-up, black-and-white 1950s America, has vanished so completely that it's hard for younger generations to even imagine it. The technology that finally solved their murders didn't exist in any science fiction they might have read. The idea that a person's genetic code could be read, stored, compared, and used to identify their relatives across generations would have seemed like magic to someone in 1959. Yet here we are, in an era where these impossibilities have become routine, where cold cases from before the moon landing can be solved using techniques that didn't exist when the original investigators retired, where justice, in some form, can reach across decades to touch crimes that everyone had given up hope of ever solving. The technique that solved the Bogle-Kalitsky case has now been used hundreds of times across the country. The Golden State Killer case opened the floodgates, and suddenly cold case units everywhere began re-examining their oldest unsolved crimes. Murders from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, crimes committed by people who'd long since died, confident they'd escape justice, were being solved at a remarkable rate. This has sparked important debates about privacy, consent, and the use of genetic information. When people upload their DNA to ancestry databases, they're primarily thinking about finding distant cousins or learning about their ethnic heritage. They're not necessarily thinking about law enforcement using that information to solve crimes. Some people celebrate this application of technology, seeing it as a powerful tool for justice. Others worry about the privacy implications, about government access to genetic information, about where the line should be drawn between public good and individual rights. Kenneth Gould's family found themselves at the center of these debates. They'd voluntarily provided DNA to help confirm their father's guilt, but their very existence in the genetic genealogy databases, even if they'd never uploaded their own DNA, made them part of the investigation. Your genetic information, it turns out, isn't entirely your own. It also belongs, in a sense, to all your relatives, both known and unknown. For cold case investigators, genetic genealogy has been nothing short of miraculous. Detective Cadner, who'd spent years frustrated by the limitations of traditional investigation, suddenly had a tool that could do what seemed impossible. He could reach back to 1959 and point directly at the guilty party. He could give families answers they'd stopped hoping for. He could bring a form of resolution to a case that had haunted his department for longer than anyone currently working there had been alive. But the bittersweet nature of that resolution can't be ignored. There was no trial, no testimony, no opportunity for Gould to face his accusers or for the community to see justice done in a courtroom. There was no chance for the families to confront him, to ask why, to see any form of remorse or hear any explanation. Kenneth Gould simply ceased to be a mystery and became a known killer, but one beyond the reach of earthly punishment. Some of Gould's own family members struggled with the revelation. They'd known him as a father, grandfather, perhaps as a generally decent man in their daily interactions. Now they had to reconcile that image with the knowledge that he'd committed terrible violence, that he'd carried that secret through decades of family dinners and holidays and ordinary life. It's a particular kind of grief, learning that someone you loved was capable of something monstrous. The case also illuminated the sheer randomness of who gets caught and who doesn't. Kenneth Gould committed murder in 1959 and simply got lucky. Lucky that DNA testing didn't exist. Lucky that his interview with investigators didn't raise enough red flags. Lucky that he didn't commit any other crimes that might have brought him back into police scrutiny. He lived 58 more years after killing Lloyd and Patty, dying of natural causes in 2007, apparently never suspected seriously enough to cost him his freedom or his reputation. This randomness haunts cold case investigators. How many other Kenneth Goulds are out there, people who committed terrible crimes and simply got away with it through a combination of circumstance, luck, and the limitations of the technology available at the time? How many families are still waiting for answers that might come too late to matter in any meaningful way? The Bogle-Kalitsky case has become a touchstone in discussions about cold case investigation and forensic genealogy. It's cited in training courses, referenced in academic papers, held up as an example of both what's possible and what's problematic about this new era of criminal investigation. The case demonstrates that even after 6 decades, even after everyone involved has died or aged beyond recognition, the truth can still emerge. But it also demonstrates the limits of that truth. Knowing who killed Lloyd and Patty doesn't bring them back. It doesn't undo 60 years of grief for their families. It doesn't give Kenneth Gould's family back the father they thought they knew. It doesn't really restore anything or heal any wounds. It simply provides an answer to a question, closes a file, allows people to stop wondering. Maybe that's enough. Maybe after 6 decades, simply knowing is a kind of justice all its own. The victims may be beyond any earthly help, the perpetrator beyond any earthly punishment, but the truth itself has value. It acknowledges what happened. It says that Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky mattered, that their deaths weren't just going to be forgotten, that someone would keep searching for answers no matter how long it took. Today, that lonely stretch of Vineyard Road outside Great Falls looks much different than it did in 1959. The trees have grown. The landscape has changed. The town has sprawled outward in new directions. But the memory of what happened there remains, kept alive partly by the decades it took to solve, partly by the remarkable nature of the eventual solution. Lloyd and Patty remain forever young in photographs and memories, frozen at 18 and 16, dressed in the styles of the late 1950s, looking out at us from a vanished world. They never got to see the 60s or 70s, never experienced the massive cultural changes that reshaped America, never lived to see computers or cell phones or the internet or any of the 1,000 things that would have seemed impossible in their time. Kenneth Gould saw all of it. He lived through it all, experienced it all, apparently unburdened by any visible guilt or fear of discovery. Then he died, and 9 years later, science reached back and named him for what he was. There's something both satisfying and deeply unsatisfying about that. Satisfying because the truth came out, because the mystery was solved, because genetic genealogy proved it could reach back through time and identify the guilty even after they're gone. Unsatisfying because it all came too late for any conventional justice, too late for Lloyd and Patty, too late for the families who grieved through decades of not knowing. But perhaps that's the nature of justice in these ancient cases. It arrives late if it arrives at all. It brings answers without providing healing. It names the guilty without providing punishment. It's incomplete, imperfect, better than nothing but far from everything anyone hoped for. And yet, the work continues. All across America, cold case detectives are opening old files, submitting old evidence for new analysis, uploading DNA profiles to genealogy databases, hoping to give other families what Lloyd and Patty's families finally received. The answer to who and why, even if the answer comes decades too late. The technology will keep improving. More cases will be solved. More families will get answers they'd given up hoping for. More long-dead criminals will be named and their secrets exposed. This is the world we live in now, where the past is never quite as buried as people once thought, where guilt can surface generations after the crime, where DNA whispers the truth long after everyone involved has turned to dust. Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky died on a frozen Montana night in January of 1959. For 60 years, Their murders remained unsolved, a mystery that haunted a community and frustrated hundreds of investigators. Then, in 2019, science gave them justice of a kind, incomplete, imperfect, but real. Their story reminds us that the truth has weight, that it matters even when it comes too late, that the work of seeking answers is worth doing even when those answers bring more pain than healing. It reminds us that the past is never really past, that crimes echo through generations, that justice delayed is still worth pursuing. And on quiet winter nights in Great Falls, when the temperature drops below zero and the wind cuts across those dark plains, maybe someone still thinks of Lloyd and Patty, two kids who drove out for an ordinary date and never came home, whose deaths remained a mystery for longer than they'd been alive, whose case finally closed 60 years later through technology that would have seemed like science fiction in their time. Maybe that's enough. Maybe being remembered, being sought after, being given a kind of posthumous justice, maybe that means something, even if it can't undo the past or restore what was lost. Maybe, after everything, that's the best we can do. Remember the victims, name the guilty, and keep searching for truth no matter how long it takes or how late it arrives. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Baby Who Lived for 9 Days. The Teresa and Pearson Case. In March of 1992, a baby girl was born in Florida who would never open her eyes, never take a first step, never speak a word. She had no future. Doctors knew this from the moment she arrived. But what happened next turned this tiny life into one of the most controversial medical and ethical debates in American history. Her name was Teresa and Campo Pearson, and though she lived for only 9 days, her story would challenge everything we thought we knew about life, death, and what it means to be human. Hello and welcome again. I'm glad you're still here. Now we're going to explore a story that sits at the intersection of medicine, law, philosophy, and grief. It's not a story of murder or mystery in the traditional sense. There are no suspects, no chase, no courtroom drama in the way you might expect. But it is a true crime story nonetheless, one that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the choices we make when facing the unthinkable. This is the story of baby Teresa, a child born without most of her brain, and the heartbreaking decision her parents made that would ignite a national firestorm. It's a story about two young people trying to find meaning in tragedy, about doctors caught between compassion and law, and about a legal system struggling to define the boundaries of life itself. The case of baby Teresa emerged at a peculiar moment in American history. The early 1990s were a time of rapid change in medical technology and ethics. Organ transplantation had become increasingly successful, saving thousands of lives each year. But with these successes came new questions, new dilemmas that previous generations had never had to face. How do we balance the rights of donors with the needs of recipients? When does life truly begin, and when does it truly end? Who gets to decide? These weren't abstract philosophical questions anymore. They were matters of life and death, playing out in hospitals and courtrooms across the country. And nowhere were these questions more urgent, more painful, than in the story I'm about to tell you. So settle in, get comfortable, let the outside world fade away for a while, and let me tell you what happened in the spring of 1992, in a hospital in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, when a baby was born who would change the way America thought about organ donation, death, and dignity. This is a story about love and loss, about hope and heartbreak, about the distance between what we wish the world could be and what the world actually is. It's a story that doesn't have easy answers, and maybe that's why it stayed with me all these years. Maybe that's why it matters. let's begin. Laura Campo was 23 years old in the summer of 1991, living in Broward County, Florida, in a small apartment not far from the beach. She worked as a waitress at a local diner, the kind of place with vinyl booths and laminated menus and coffee that was always hot but never quite good. It was honest work, the kind that left her feet aching at the end of a shift, but she didn't mind. She was saving money, making plans, dreaming about the future. Her boyfriend, Justin Pearson, was 25. He worked construction, mostly residential jobs, framing houses, installing drywall, laying tile. His hands were calloused and his back was often sore, but like Laura, he was building toward something. They'd been together for 2 years, and though they hadn't officially gotten engaged, they talked about marriage the way young couples do, casually but seriously, testing how the words felt in their mouths. They weren't wealthy. They didn't have college degrees or trust funds or family connections. They were working-class kids in South Florida, trying to make their way in a world that didn't hand out second chances. But they had each other, and they had hope, and in the summer of 1991, they discovered they were going to have a baby. Laura found out first. She'd suspected for a week or so. Her period was late. She felt nauseous in the mornings. Her breasts were tender. She bought a pregnancy test at the drugstore, took it home, locked herself in the bathroom, and waited the longest 3 minutes of her life. 2 pink lines. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the test, trying to absorb what it meant. She was pregnant. She was going to be a mother. The future she'd been imagining suddenly became much more concrete, much more immediate. She told Justin that evening. He was scared. He admitted that right away, but he was also excited. They talked late into the night about what it would mean, how they would manage, what kind of parents they wanted to be. By the time they finally went to sleep, they'd convinced themselves that everything would work out. They were young, but they were strong. They would figure it out. The first few weeks of the pregnancy passed in a blur of morning sickness and doctor's appointments and tentative excitement. Laura's mother was thrilled about becoming a grandmother. Justin's parents were more reserved, more cautious, but they came around. Friends at the diner threw Laura a small surprise party, hung up a banner that said, "Congratulations," brought gifts wrapped in pastel paper. Felt, for those early weeks, like everything was falling into place. Laura's first official prenatal appointment was in late August. She and Justin went together, holding hands in the waiting room, flipping through parenting magazines, trying not to seem as nervous as they felt. When the nurse called Laura's name, they both stood up. The appointment was routine. Blood pressure, weight, urine sample, blood draw. The doctor, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Morrison, asked questions about Laura's medical history, her family history, whether she smoked or drank. Laura answered honestly. No smoking, no drinking since she'd found out, no major health problems in her family. Dr. Morrison nodded, made notes, smiled encouragingly. Everything looked good, she said. Everything was progressing normally. They scheduled the next appointment for mid-October, around the time Laura would be 20 weeks along. That was when they'd do the anatomy scan, the detailed ultrasound that would show the baby's development, reveal any potential problems, and, if Laura and Justin wanted, tell them whether they were having a boy or a girl. Laura left that first appointment feeling reassured. The doctor had said everything was fine. That was good enough for her. The weeks passed. Summer turned to autumn. Laura's belly began to show. Just a small bump at first, barely noticeable under loose clothing. She started buying maternity clothes at thrift stores, traded shifts at the diner to avoid the busiest times, saved every dollar she could. Justin picked up extra hours at work. They were going to need money, for baby supplies, for medical bills, for all the unexpected expenses that come with a child. He worked late, came home exhausted, but he never complained. This was what you did, he told Laura. This was what being a father meant. They started making plans. They couldn't afford a nursery, but they could convert part of their bedroom into a space for the baby. They bought a used crib from a garage sale, repainted it white, set it up in the corner. Laura's mother gave them boxes of hand-me-down baby clothes, tiny onesies and sleepers that had belonged to Laura when she was an infant. They were building a life for their child, piece by piece, day by day. And then came the anatomy scan. October 15th, 1991. Laura's second trimester. 20 weeks along, almost halfway through the pregnancy. The ultrasound was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Laura had to drink 32 ounces of water beforehand. A full bladder helped with the imaging, and by the time they arrived at the clinic, she was uncomfortable, fidgeting in her seat, desperate to use the bathroom. Justin tried to distract her with small talk, but neither of them was really paying attention. They were both thinking about the same thing. In a few minutes, they were going to see their baby. Really see it. Not just hear the heartbeat or see a blob on a screen, but see its face, its fingers, its tiny feet. The technician called them back. Her name was Michelle, and she was young, probably not much older than Laura. She led them to a small room with dim lighting and a padded examination table. Laura lay down, pulled up her shirt, and Michelle squeezed cold gel onto her belly. The screen flickered to life. First, everything seemed fine. Michelle moved the wand across Laura's abdomen, pointed out features on the screen. There's the spine, there's a hand, there's the heart beating. Laura and Justin stared at the monitor, mesmerized. That was their baby, their child. It was real. But then Michelle went quiet. She moved the wand higher, focusing on the baby's head. She lingered there, adjusting the angle, pressing harder. Her expression shifted just slightly from casual concentration to something else. Concern, maybe, or confusion. Laura noticed immediately. Is something wrong? Michelle didn't answer right away. She kept staring at the screen, biting her lower lip. Then she set down the wand and stood up. "Let me get the doctor," she said. Her voice was carefully neutral. "I just want her to take a look." Laura's heart started racing. Justin reached for her hand, squeezed it tight. "I'm sure it's fine," he said, but his voice betrayed his doubt. Michelle left the room. Laura and Justin waited in silence, staring at each other, trying not to panic. 5 minutes later, Dr. Morrison came in. She didn't smile. She sat down beside the examination table, picked up the ultrasound wand, and began examining the screen herself. The silence stretched. Laura felt tears forming in her eyes even before the doctor spoke. Finally, Dr. Morrison set down the wand and turned to face them. Her expression was gentle but grave. "I need to talk to you about what we're seeing," she said quietly. "There's a problem with your baby's development." The next 10 minutes were a blur of medical terminology that Laura and Justin barely understood. Dr. Morrison used words like neural tube defect and anencephaly and incompatible with life. And though she explained each term carefully, patiently, the basic message was devastatingly simple. Their baby was missing most of its brain. Dr. Morrison showed them the ultrasound images, pointed to the areas where the skull hadn't formed properly, where the cerebral hemispheres should have been but weren't. She explained that anencephaly occurs very early in pregnancy, usually within the first few weeks after conception, when the neural tube, the structure that eventually becomes the brain and spinal cord, fails to close properly at the top. "No one knows exactly why it happens," she said. "It's not genetic, not hereditary, not caused by anything the mother did or didn't do. It's just a random developmental error, a tragedy of biology." "Can it be fixed?" Justin asked. His voice was shaking. "Surgery? Or medication or something?" Dr. Morrison shook her head. "I'm sorry. No, there's no treatment, no cure. Babies with anencephaly." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They don't survive. Most are stillborn. Those who are born alive typically die within hours or days. The longest recorded survival is a few weeks, but that's extremely rare." Laura was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "Are you sure? Could the ultrasound be wrong?" "I wish I could tell you it was a mistake," Dr. Morrison said, "but the images are very clear. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She gave them a moment to absorb this, then continued. "You have options. You can terminate the pregnancy now if that's what you choose, or you can continue and carry to term. Either way, I'll support you, but I want you to understand what continuing the pregnancy means. Your baby will not survive. That's certain. Laura looked at Justin. Justin looked at Laura. Neither of them knew what to say. Dr. Morrison stood up. You don't have to decide right now. Take some time. Talk to each other, talk to your families. I'll be here whenever you're ready. She left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Laura and Justin sat together in the dim light, holding each other, crying. They spent the next week in a fog of grief and confusion. Laura called in sick to work. Justin canceled a job. They stayed in their apartment, curtains drawn, trying to process what they'd been told. Laura's mother came over, brought food they didn't eat, sat with them while they cried. She didn't offer advice, didn't try to tell them what to do. She just listened. Justin's parents called. They were more practical, more focused on next steps. What were Laura and Justin going to do? Had they considered termination? It might be easier, they said. Kinder, even. Why put Laura through months of pregnancy when the outcome was inevitable? But Laura wasn't ready to make that decision. Not yet. She spent hours researching anencephaly online, reading medical journals and message boards and first-hand accounts from other mothers who'd gone through this. The information was consistent. Every source confirmed what Dr. Morrison had told them. Anencephaly was fatal. There were no exceptions, no miracle stories, no last-minute cures. But Laura also found something else in her research. She found stories of parents who had chosen to carry to term, who had delivered their anencephalic babies and held them for whatever brief time they had. Some of these parents described finding peace in that decision, in being able to say hello and goodbye, in treating their child with dignity even in death. And she found something else, too. She found stories of parents who had donated their anencephalic babies' organs. Organ donation from anencephalic infants was not a new idea. It had been proposed and debated for years in medical and ethical circles. The logic was straightforward. Anencephalic babies were going to die, but their organs, their hearts, livers, kidneys, were often healthy and fully functional. Those organs could save other babies, infants on transplant waiting lists who would die without new organs. It seemed like a way to find meaning in tragedy, to transform a death into life. But the practice was controversial. Some ethicists argued that using anencephalic babies as organ donors treated them as means to an end, as objects rather than persons. Others raised concerns about the definition of death. Anencephalic babies, while lacking higher brain function, still had functioning brain stems. They could breathe on their own, their hearts beat on their own. Under the legal definition of death, they were alive. And you cannot harvest organs from a living person. That's murder. Laura didn't know about these debates when she first read about organ donation. All she knew was that it felt right. If her baby was going to die anyway, if there was no hope of survival, then why not let her organs save other children? Why not let something good come from something so unbearably sad? She mentioned the idea to Justin that evening. They were sitting on the couch, the television on but neither of them watching it. I've been thinking, Laura said quietly, about the baby, about what happens after. Justin looked at her. What do you mean? I want to carry to term, she said. I want to meet her. I want to hold her, even if it's just for a little while. Justin nodded slowly. Okay, and I want to donate her organs, Laura continued. If that's possible. I want her to help other babies. I think that's what I need. I think that's how I can do this. Justin was quiet for a long moment. Then he took Laura's hand. If that's what you want, he said, then that's what we'll do. The next day, Laura called Dr. Morrison and told her the decision. She was going to continue the pregnancy, and she wanted to explore organ donation. Dr. Morrison was supportive but cautious. I think that's a beautiful idea, she said. But I have to be honest with you, Laura. It's complicated. Legally, medically, ethically, it's not straightforward. Let me make some calls, talk to some people. I'll find out what's possible. Over the next few days, Dr. Morrison consulted with colleagues, contacted transplant coordinators, researched the legal status of organ donation from anencephalic infants. What she found was discouraging. Florida law, like federal law, defined death as the irreversible cessation of all brain function, including the brainstem. Anencephalic babies didn't meet that criteria. They had brain stems. They were legally alive. Several hospitals in the past had attempted organ donation from anencephalic infants, but the procedures had been halted due to legal and ethical concerns. In 1988, Loma Linda University Medical Center in California had even established a protocol specifically for anencephalic organ donation, but it was shut down after just 9 months because of the complications involved. The problem was timing. Anencephalic babies could survive for hours or days after birth, but their organs deteriorated quickly. By the time they were declared legally dead, after their brain stems stopped functioning, their organs were no longer viable for transplant. The window of opportunity was impossibly narrow. Dr. Morrison explained all of this to Laura and Justin in early November. She was gentle but clear. What you're asking for is nearly impossible under current law. I'm not saying it can't be done, but the obstacles are significant. Laura refused to give up. There has to be a way, she said. There has to be. Dr. Morrison sighed. The only way would be to change the legal definition of death. To get a court to declare your baby dead at birth, before her brain stem stops functioning. It's never been done before. I don't know if it's even possible. Then we'll try, Laura said. We have to try. As Laura's pregnancy progressed, she and Justin began preparing for what was to come. They knew they needed legal help, medical support, and probably media attention to have any chance of making organ donation happen. They reached out to several lawyers, explained their situation. Most declined to take the case. It was too controversial, too complicated, too likely to fail. But one lawyer, a man named Stephen Showman, was intrigued. Showman was known for taking difficult, precedent-setting cases. He believed in the cause, believed that the law should evolve to reflect new medical realities. He agreed to represent Laura and Justin pro bono. Showman spent the next few months preparing. He researched every legal case involving brain death and organ donation. He consulted with medical ethicists, transplant specialists, neonatal doctors. He drafted legal arguments, anticipated counterarguments, prepared for a battle he knew would be uphill. Meanwhile, Laura's pregnancy continued. Her belly grew. She felt the baby kick, felt her move, and every movement was a bittersweet reminder of what was coming. She tried to cherish these moments, tried to bond with her daughter, even though she knew their time together would be brief. People at the diner started asking questions. When was she due? Was she excited? Did she know if it was a boy or a girl? Laura answered as honestly as she could without going into detail. Yes, it's a girl. Yes, we're excited. Thank you. She didn't tell them the rest. In February of 1992, Laura and Justin decided to go public with their story. They contacted local news stations, gave interviews to newspapers, explained what they were trying to do and why. The response was immediate and intense. Some people were deeply moved by their story. They saw two young parents trying to find hope in tragedy, trying to turn death into life. Letters of support poured in. Strangers sent cards, flowers, donations. But others were outraged. Religious groups condemned the plan as tantamount to infanticide. Disability rights advocates worried about the precedent it might set, argued that declaring anencephalic babies dead would devalue the lives of people with severe brain injuries or developmental disabilities. The debate spilled onto talk shows, radio programs, editorial pages. Everyone, it seemed, had an opinion. Laura and Justin tried to ignore the noise, tried to focus on what mattered. But it was hard. The attention was overwhelming, the criticism painful. Through it all, they held on to their conviction. They believed they were doing the right thing. They believed their daughter's death could have meaning. By early March, Laura was in her final weeks of pregnancy. The baby's due date was March 20th, just days away. Showman had prepared all the legal documents. He'd arranged for medical experts to testify. He'd coordinated with Broward General Medical Center, where Laura would deliver, to ensure that if the court ruling went their way, the transplant team would be ready. Everything was in place. Now they just had to wait. Laura spent those final days trying to prepare emotionally for what was coming. She wrote letters to her daughter, letters the baby would never read but that Laura needed to write anyway. She bought a small white dress, the kind babies wear for christenings, and set it aside for the funeral. Justin built a small wooden box to hold mementos, ultrasound photos, a lock of Laura's hair, the outfit they'd bring the baby home in if circumstances were different. They were saying goodbye to a child who wasn't even born yet. On the evening of March 19th, Laura started having contractions. It was time. Laura's labor began just after 8 in the evening on March 19th, 1992. The contractions started mild, almost manageable, just a tightening sensation across her lower belly that came and went every 15 or 20 minutes. She was folding laundry when the first one hit, and she stopped mid-fold, hands gripping a small pink onesie they'd bought weeks ago in a moment of optimism they both now regretted. Justin saw her expression change. "Is it time?" Laura nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. They'd packed a hospital bag weeks earlier, following the checklist from the pregnancy book Laura's mother had given her. Change of clothes, toiletries, snacks, a camera, the white christening dress, paperwork from their lawyer. Everything they'd need for a birth that would also be a goodbye. The drive to Broward General Medical Center took 20 minutes through light evening traffic. Laura counted contractions, breathed through them the way she'd learned in the single childbirth class they'd attended. Justin drove carefully, checking on her every few seconds, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. They arrived at the hospital at 9:15. A nurse met them at the entrance with a wheelchair, whisked Laura up to the maternity ward while Justin parked the car. By the time he reached her room, Laura was already in a hospital gown, monitors strapped to her belly, and 4-line in her arm. The contractions were getting closer together now. Every 10 minutes, then every 8, then every 5. Laura had opted for an epidural. There was no reason to suffer through the pain, not when the outcome was predetermined. The anesthesiologist arrived around 11, administered the medication, and within 20 minutes Laura felt the pain fade to a dull pressure. Dr. Morrison came in just after midnight. She examined Laura, checked her dilation, reviewed the fetal monitors. Everything was progressing normally, she said. They were looking at a birth sometime in the early morning, probably between 6 and 8. "Are you ready?" Dr. Morrison asked gently. Laura shook her head. "No, but it doesn't matter, does it?" "No," Dr. Morrison admitted. "It doesn't." The hours passed slowly. Justin sat beside Laura's bed, holding her hand, trying to think of things to say and coming up empty. "What do you say when you're waiting for your daughter to be born so she can die?" Nurses came and went, checking monitors, adjusting equipment, speaking in low, sympathetic tones. Word had spread through the hospital about who Laura was, about the baby she was carrying and what she was trying to do. Some of the staff were supportive. Others were uncomfortable, uncertain how to act around a mother who planned to donate her dying baby's organs. Around 4 in the morning, Dr. Morrison returned. Laura was fully dilated. It was time to push. The delivery itself was surprisingly quick. 3 contractions, maybe 20 minutes total. Laura pushed when Dr. Morrison told her to push, breathed when she was told to breathe, and at 5:37 on the morning of March 21st, 1992, Teresa and Campo Pearson entered the world. She didn't cry. Anencephalic babies rarely cry. The brain structures that control crying, the parts that process discomfort and signal distress, weren't there. Teresa emerged silent, her tiny body covered in vernix, her eyes closed, the top of her head missing in a way that made several nurses in the delivery room look away. Dr. Morrison clamped and cut the umbilical cord, then carried Teresa to a warming table. She cleaned the baby quickly, efficiently, wrapped her in a soft blanket, and brought her to Laura. "Do you want to hold her?" Dr. Morrison asked. Laura nodded, unable to speak. She took Teresa in her arms, looked down at her daughter's face, and wept. Teresa was tiny, 5 pounds, 2 ounces, 18 inches long. She had wisps of dark hair around the base of her skull. Laura's nose, Justin's chin. Her eyes were fused shut. They would never open, and where the top of her head should have been, there was only a soft mass of tissue covered by a thin membrane. But she was breathing. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Her heart was beating. She was alive in the most technical sense of the word. Laura held her for a long time, memorizing every detail. Justin leaned in close, touched Teresa's tiny hand, felt her fingers curl reflexively around his thumb. "Hello, sweetheart," Laura whispered. "We're your mama and daddy. We love you so much." Teresa didn't respond, couldn't respond. But Laura talked to her anyway, told her she was beautiful, told her she was wanted, told her everything would be okay. It was a lie, but it was a lie born of love. Within an hour of Teresa's birth, Stephen Showman was notified. He'd been on standby for days, waiting for the call. Now that Teresa was born, the legal clock was ticking. Showman immediately filed an emergency petition with Broward County Circuit Court, requesting that Judge Estella Moriarty declare Teresa legally dead so that her organs could be harvested for donation. The petition was extraordinary. In it, Showman argued that Teresa, while technically alive under the letter of the law, was dead in every meaningful sense. She had no cerebral cortex, no capacity for consciousness, no possibility of awareness. She would never think, never feel, never experience anything resembling life as we understand it. The law's definition of death, Showman argued, was outdated. It had been established in 1968 before modern neuroimaging, before our current understanding of brain function. That definition required the cessation of all brain function, including the brainstem, but it didn't account for cases like Teresa's, cases where the brainstem functioned but everything else was absent. Showman cited medical literature, philosophical arguments, precedents from other areas of law. He presented affidavits from doctors who'd examined Teresa, all confirming that she had no higher brain function, no possibility of recovery or development. He also presented the pragmatic argument. There were babies dying on transplant waiting lists, infants who needed hearts, livers, kidneys. Teresa's organs were healthy and could save multiple lives. Why should those babies die to preserve a legal technicality? The petition was filed on the morning of March 21st. Judge Moriarty scheduled an emergency hearing for March 23rd, just 2 days away. She understood the urgency. Every day that passed was a day Teresa's organs deteriorated, a day that brought her closer to natural death and made transplantation less likely. Back at the hospital, Laura and Justin were trying to make the most of whatever time they had with their daughter. The hospital had given them a private room, away from the regular nursery where healthy babies cried and new parents celebrated. It was quiet, dimly lit, almost peaceful. Teresa lay in a bassinet beside Laura's bed, wrapped in blankets, monitors tracking her heart rate and breathing. Laura barely slept. She watched Teresa constantly, looking for any sign of awareness, any indication that her daughter was somehow experiencing the world. But there was nothing. Teresa's eyes stayed closed. She didn't move except for occasional reflexive twitches. Her breathing was regular but mechanical, driven by the brainstem's automatic functions. Friends and family came to visit. Laura's mother held Teresa, cried quietly, said a prayer. Justin's parents came, stayed for a few minutes, left looking shaken. The chaplain stopped by, offered to baptize Teresa if Laura and Justin wanted. They declined. They weren't particularly religious, and it seemed like an empty gesture for a baby who would never know what baptism meant. Dr. Morrison checked on them several times a day. She was worried about Laura's emotional state, concerned that the prolonged exposure to a dying infant might cause lasting psychological trauma. But Laura insisted she wanted every moment with her daughter, however painful. "I'm her mother," Laura said. "This is all I get. I'm not wasting it." March 23rd arrived. The hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Showman arrived at the courthouse early, reviewed his notes, prepared to argue the most unusual case of his career. The state of Florida, represented by Assistant Attorney General Dorothy Smilac, was prepared to argue the opposite position. The courtroom was packed. News crews lined the hallway outside, cameras ready. Activists on both sides held signs, some supporting Laura and Justin, others condemning what they called the harvesting of disabled babies. Judge Estella Moriarty took the bench at exactly 2 o'clock. She was in her late 50s, known for her careful deliberation and resistance to being rushed into decisions. She looked out at the crowded courtroom, then down at the papers before her. "This is a deeply troubling case," she began. "I want everyone here to understand that I'm not taking it lightly. What we're being asked to do today is unprecedented. I intend to hear all arguments fully before making any decision." Showman presented his case first. He spoke for nearly an hour, laying out the medical facts about anencephaly, the philosophical arguments about personhood and death, the legal precedents that might support redefining death in Teresa's specific circumstances. He called Dr. Morrison to testify. She explained Teresa's condition in detail, described the ultrasounds, the delivery, the baby's current state. She confirmed that Teresa had no cerebral cortex, no capacity for awareness, no possibility of survival beyond a few days at most. "In your medical opinion," Showman asked, "is Teresa and Pearson a person in any meaningful sense?" Dorothy Smilac objected immediately. "Your Honor, that's not a medical question. That's a philosophical and legal question." Judge Moriarty sustained the objection. Showman tried again. "Doctor, does Teresa have any capacity for consciousness?" "No," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "None at all. Any capacity for sensation, for pain, for awareness of her surroundings? No. In your experience, have you ever seen an anencephalic infant exhibit any sign of higher brain function? No. It's not possible. The structures aren't there." Showman nodded. "Thank you, Doctor." Dorothy Smilac's cross-examination was brief but pointed. "Dr. Morrison, is Teresa and Pearson breathing on her own?" "Yes." "Is her heart beating on her own?" "Yes." "By the current legal definition of death in the state of Florida, is she dead?" Dr. Morrison hesitated. "No, not by the current definition." "Thank you." No further questions. Smilac then presented the state's case. She argued that the law was clear and shouldn't be changed by a single court ruling in an emotional case. Brain death, as defined by Florida statute, required the irreversible cessation of all brain function. Teresa didn't meet that standard. Her brainstem was functioning. She was alive. To declare her dead, Smilac argued, would open a Pandora's box. What about people in persistent vegetative states who had no higher brain function? What about people with severe brain damage? Would they be declared dead too? Where would the line be drawn? She also raised concerns about precedent. If this court ruling went through, what would stop hospitals from pressuring parents of anencephalic babies to donate organs? What would stop doctors from declaring people dead prematurely to harvest organs for transplant? "Your Honor," Smilac said, "we understand the emotion in this case. We understand that Laura and Justin Pearson are grieving parents trying to find meaning in tragedy. But we cannot change fundamental definitions of life and death based on one family's wishes, no matter how sympathetic we are to their situation." She called her own expert witness, a neurologist named Dr. Richard Berkowitz, who testified that while Teresa's condition was tragic, she was undeniably alive by any reasonable medical or legal standard. "The brainstem controls essential functions," Dr. Berkowitz explained. "Breathing, heart rate, basic reflexes. These are not trivial functions. They are the foundation of biological life. To say that someone is dead while their brainstem is functioning is to fundamentally misunderstand what death means." Showman cross-examined aggressively, but Dr. Berkowitz held firm. The law was the law, and Teresa didn't meet the criteria for brain death. The hearing lasted 4 hours. By the time both sides had presented their arguments, it was after 6 in the evening. Judge Moriarty called a brief recess, retired to her chambers, and reviewed the evidence. 45 minutes later, she returned to the bench. The courtroom went silent. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented today," Judge Moriarty said. "I've considered the medical testimony, the legal arguments, the philosophical questions raised. This is, without question, one of the most difficult decisions I've ever been asked to make." She paused, looked directly at where Showman was sitting. I am deeply sympathetic to Laura and Justin Pearson. I cannot imagine the pain they're experiencing. The desire to find meaning in their daughter's death is completely understandable, even admirable. Another pause. But sympathy cannot be the basis for legal decisions. The law is clear. Brain death requires the cessation of all brain function, including the brainstem. Teresa and Pearson does not meet that standard. Her brainstem is functioning. She is breathing on her own. Her heart is beating on her own. Laura, watching via video link from her hospital room, started crying. I understand the arguments about consciousness and personhood, Judge Moriarty continued. But those are philosophical arguments, not legal ones. Florida law does not distinguish between higher and lower brain function. It does not make exceptions for tragic cases. And this court does not have the authority to rewrite that law, no matter how compelling the circumstances. She looked down at her notes, then back up. For these reasons, I must deny the petition. Teresa and Pearson is alive under Florida law. Her organs cannot be harvested while she remains alive. I'm truly sorry. The gavel came down. Showman immediately filed an appeal to the 4th District Court of Appeal. The paperwork was submitted that evening. The appellate court agreed to review it on an emergency basis, scheduling oral arguments for March 25th, just 2 days away. But by then, Teresa had been alive for 4 days. Her condition was beginning to deteriorate. Her breathing, while still regular, was becoming shallower. Her heart rate was fluctuating. The pediatricians monitoring her said she likely had only a few more days at most. Laura and Justin held their daughter constantly during those days, rarely sleeping, barely eating. They sang to her, read to her from children's books, told her stories about the life she would have had if things were different. The media coverage was intense. News crews camped outside the hospital. Headlines screamed competing narratives. Parents fight to donate dying babies' organs versus court refuses to allow babies' death for transplants. Everyone had an opinion. The case became a lightning rod for debates about medical ethics, disability rights, religious beliefs, legal precedent. Laura and Justin tried to tune it out, tried to focus on Teresa. But it was impossible. Their private tragedy had become a public spectacle. On March 25th, the 4th District Court of Appeal heard oral arguments. Showman made essentially the same case he'd made to Judge Moriarty, emphasizing the urgency, the medical realities, the babies dying while waiting for organs. The state repeated its position. The law was clear. Teresa was alive. Changing that would require legislative action, not judicial fiat. The 3-judge panel deliberated for less than an hour. Their ruling was unanimous. They denied the appeal. While we are moved by the Pearson situation, the opinion read, we cannot in good conscience redefine death to accommodate organ donation. The implications would be far-reaching and potentially dangerous. This is a matter for the legislature, not the courts. Showman could have appealed to the Florida Supreme Court, but he knew it was futile. The case had already been through 2 courts. Both had ruled the same way. And most importantly, time had run out. Teresa was dying. Even if, by some miracle, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case and ruled in their favor, Teresa's organs would no longer be viable. It was over. Showman called Justin that evening, told him the news. Justin thanked him for trying, hung up, and told Laura. They sat together in the hospital room, holding Teresa, crying. We tried, Laura whispered. At least we tried. On the morning of March 27th, Teresa had been alive for 6 days. That was already longer than most anencephalic babies survive. Dr. Morrison told Laura and Justin that Teresa's brainstem must be remarkably resilient. But even so, the end was near. Teresa's breathing had become irregular. Instead of the steady rhythm of her first few days, she now had periods where she'd breathe rapidly for a minute or two, then hardly breathe at all for several seconds. Her skin, which had been pink and healthy-looking at birth, was taking on a grayish tint. Her body temperature fluctuated despite the warming blankets. The hospital's ethics committee had met several times to discuss Teresa's care. Some members felt that continuing aggressive monitoring was pointless and even cruel. Not to Teresa, who couldn't suffer, but to Laura and Justin, who had to watch their daughter's slow decline measured by beeping monitors and digital readouts. Others argued that documenting Teresa's survival was important for medical knowledge. Anencephalic babies who lived more than a few days were rare enough that every data point mattered for understanding the condition. In the end, they left the decision to Laura and Justin. Did they want all the monitors? Or did they want to simply hold their daughter without machines tracking every heartbeat? Laura and Justin chose the monitors. They wanted to know. They wanted to understand exactly what was happening, even if it hurt. By this point, the media circus outside the hospital had intensified rather than diminished. The courts had ruled, the legal drama was over, but the ethical debate raged on. Newspaper editorials argued both sides. Religious leaders gave sermons about the sanctity of all life, even lives without consciousness. Medical ethicists published op-eds questioning whether the legal definition of death was adequate for modern medicine. Disability rights organizations issued statements expressing concern that treating anencephalic babies as organ donors would devalue the lives of people with brain injuries or developmental disabilities. They worried about a slippery slope, where society might decide that certain lives weren't worth living and could be ended for others' benefit. Transplant advocates argued the opposite. They pointed to the babies dying on waiting lists, the shortage of infant organs, the waste of allowing Teresa's healthy organs to die with her when they could save multiple lives. And through it all, in a quiet hospital room, Laura and Justin sat with their daughter and tried to ignore the world outside. Visitors continued to come. Laura's mother visited every day, often staying for hours. She'd hold Teresa, rock her gently, sing old lullabies. Justin's father came once more, stayed for only a few minutes, left looking devastated. Friends from the diner where Laura worked sent flowers, cards, a teddy bear that sat on the windowsill. A group from a local church, strangers to Laura and Justin, came to pray for Teresa. Laura let them in, appreciated the gesture even though she wasn't sure what they were praying for. Healing? That was impossible. Peace? Maybe. Or maybe they were just praying because they didn't know what else to do. The hospital chaplain, Father Michael, became a regular presence. He was an older man, gentle and non-judgmental. He never pushed religion on Laura and Justin, never suggested that Teresa's condition was God's will or part of some divine plan. He just sat with them, listened when they needed to talk, offered silence when they didn't. "You're doing everything right," Father Michael told Laura one evening. "You're loving her. That's all any parent can do." "It doesn't feel like enough," Laura said. "It never does," Father Michael replied. "But it's everything." On March 28th, 7 days after her birth, Teresa's heart rate began dropping. It had been steady at around 140 beats per minute for most of the week, but now it was falling 130, 120, 110. Dr. Morrison warned Laura and Justin that this was likely the beginning of the end. The brainstem was finally failing, unable to maintain the body's basic functions any longer. "How long?" Justin asked. Dr. Morrison shook her head. "Hours, maybe. A day or two at most." "I'm sorry." They called their families, told them to come if they wanted to say goodbye. Laura's mother arrived within an hour. Justin's parents came that evening. A few close friends came. The hospital bent the visitation rules, allowed everyone in. The room was crowded but quiet. People took turns holding Teresa, touching her tiny hand, saying goodbye to a baby they'd barely had a chance to know. Laura held Teresa most of the time, unwilling to let go, memorizing the weight of her daughter in her arms. She whispered things she wanted Teresa to know. How much she was loved, how wanted she'd been, how her parents would never forget her. Justin sat beside Laura, his arm around her shoulders, his other hand resting on Teresa's back. He didn't say much. He'd never been good with words, but his presence said everything that needed to be said. The night of March 29th was long. Teresa's condition continued to deteriorate. Her breathing became more erratic, long pauses between breaths, then sudden rapid breathing, then more pauses. Her heart rate dropped further, 90 beats per minute, then 80, then 70. The monitors beeped constantly, alarms going off every few minutes as her vitals dipped below safe thresholds. The nurses kept turning off the alarms, resetting them, only for them to sound again moments later. Around 3 in the morning, Dr. Morrison suggested they turn off the monitors altogether. "They're not helping," she said gently. "They're just making noise. Teresa doesn't need them anymore." Laura agreed. The monitors were switched off. The room went quiet except for the sound of Teresa's breathing, shallow, irregular, but still there. Laura lay in the hospital bed with Teresa on her chest, feeling her daughter's small body rise and fall with each breath. Justin lay beside them, his arm around both of them. They stayed like that for hours, not talking, just being together as a family for whatever time they had left. Teresa and Campo Pearson died at 6:17 in the morning on March 30th, 1992. There was no dramatic moment, no final crisis. She simply stopped breathing. One breath, then another, then a long pause, and then nothing. Laura felt it happen. She felt Teresa's chest stop moving. She felt the small body in her arms go still. "Justin," she whispered. He was already awake, already knew. They held Teresa for a long time after she died, neither of them wanting to let go. Dr. Morrison came in eventually, checked for a heartbeat, confirmed what they already knew. "I'm so sorry," she said. "You were wonderful parents to her. I hope you know that." Laura nodded, unable to speak. A nurse brought paperwork, death certificates, forms for the medical examiner, information about funeral arrangements. Laura and Justin signed what they needed to sign, barely reading the documents. The hospital asked if they wanted Teresa baptized post-mortem. Some families found comfort in that. Laura declined. Teresa was at peace now, if she'd ever been aware enough to need peace. Rituals felt hollow. They dressed Teresa in the white christening gown they'd brought, the one Laura had bought weeks ago for the funeral. They took photographs, knowing they'd want them later, even though right now the idea of looking at pictures was unbearable. And then, finally, they let the nurses take Teresa's body. By the time Teresa died, her organs were no longer viable for transplant. Dr. Morrison had tried, even at the end, to salvage something. She'd contacted transplant coordinators, asked if there was any possibility. But the answer was no. Teresa had been alive, legally, medically alive, for 9 days. Her organs had deteriorated too much. The kidneys were damaged from decreased blood flow. The liver was failing. Even the heart, which had beaten so steadily for over a week, was no longer strong enough to transplant. The very thing that had kept Teresa legally alive. Her functioning brainstem had also destroyed any chance of her organs saving other babies. Laura and Justin had fought for nothing. The legal battle, the media attention, the public debate, all of it had been for nothing. Teresa had died, and no one else had been helped. It was the cruelest irony. The funeral was held on April 2nd, a small private ceremony at a cemetery in Broward County. Only family and a few close friends attended. Laura had asked the media not to come, and for once, they respected her wishes. The service was brief. A minister said some words about innocence and peace. Laura's mother read a poem. Justin's father gave a short eulogy, his voice breaking as he talked about the granddaughter he'd barely known. Laura stood at the graveside, holding Justin's hand, staring at the tiny white casket that seemed impossibly small to contain a person, even a person who'd only lived 9 days. The minister offered to say a prayer. Laura nodded. She didn't believe it would do anything, but she didn't object. They lowered Teresa's casket into the ground. Laura threw in a single white rose, and then it was over. The weeks after Teresa's funeral were the hardest of Laura's life. She tried to go back to work, but she couldn't focus. She'd be taking an order or refilling coffee, and suddenly she'd be thinking about Teresa, about the weight of her in her arms, about the sound of her breathing that last night. She'd have to excuse herself, go cry in the bathroom, try to pull herself together. After 2 weeks, her boss gently suggested she take more time. Laura didn't argue. Justin went back to construction work, threw himself into physical labor as a way to avoid thinking. He worked long hours, came home exhausted, barely spoke. Laura understood. They were both grieving, both trying to survive in whatever way they could. Their relationship suffered. They'd been through something traumatic together, but instead of bringing them closer, it seemed to push them apart. They reminded each other of what they'd lost. Every conversation, every look, carried the weight of Teresa's absence. They tried couples counseling for a few months. It helped a little, but not enough. By the summer of 1993, about a year after Teresa's death, they separated. The breakup was amicable, sad rather than angry. They still cared about each other, but they couldn't be together anymore. The grief was too heavy. Laura moved back in with her mother. Justin moved to Tampa for a fresh start. They stayed in touch occasionally, exchanged cards on Teresa's birthday and the anniversary of her death, but they weren't part of each other's lives anymore. The case of baby Teresa didn't fade quietly into history. Instead, it became a landmark example in medical ethics courses, law school classes, philosophy seminars. In the years following Teresa's death, dozens of academic papers were published analyzing the case from every angle: legal, medical, ethical, philosophical. Scholars debated whether the courts had made the right decision, whether the law needed to change, whether there was a coherent way to think about death and personhood in cases like this. Some argued that Teresa's case exposed fundamental flaws in the brain death standard. They pointed out that brain death was originally conceived for a very specific situation: patients on life support machines whose entire brains had stopped functioning. It wasn't designed for cases like anencephaly, where part of the brain never developed in the first place. These scholars proposed a new standard: higher brain death or cortical death. Under this standard, someone could be declared dead if they permanently lacked any capacity for consciousness, even if their brainstem was still functioning. This would allow for organ donation from anencephalic infants while theoretically protecting people with disabilities or brain injuries who retain some level of awareness. But others vehemently opposed this idea. They argued that any move away from whole brain death toward higher brain death was dangerous. Who would decide what level of brain function constituted personhood? What about people in minimally conscious states? What about people with severe dementia? If we said that Teresa was dead because she lacked consciousness, what would stop us from declaring other unconscious people dead? The debate was philosophical, medical, and deeply personal, and it had no clear resolution. Legally, Teresa's case set a clear precedent. Anencephalic infants are alive under current law and cannot be used as organ donors before meeting the standard criteria for brain death. Several states considered legislation to create exceptions for anencephalic organ donation. None passed. The concerns about slippery slopes and dangerous precedents were too strong. There was one significant attempt in 1994, 2 years after Teresa's death. The American Medical Association's Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs issued an opinion suggesting that it might be ethical to use anencephalic infants as organ donors before brain death, as long as certain safeguards were in place. The proposal was immediately controversial. Disability rights groups condemned it. The AMA received thousands of letters protesting the opinion. Medical ethicists were divided. Within a year, the AMA reversed its position. The Council issued a new opinion stating that anencephalic infants should not be used as organ donors before brain death, that the existing standards should be maintained. It was a total defeat for anyone hoping to change the law in the wake of Teresa's case. But perhaps the most interesting legal development came in 1993, when Teresa's case was appealed one final time to the Florida Supreme Court. This wasn't a new appeal to save Teresa. She'd been dead for a year by then, but rather an appeal of the legal principles established by the lower courts. Showman, still representing Laura and Justin, argued that the case raised important constitutional and statutory questions that needed to be resolved at the highest state level. The Florida Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. Oral arguments were held in October 1993. Both sides presented essentially the same arguments they'd made in the lower courts, but now with the luxury of time, without the urgency of a dying infant. The court issued its decision in April 1994. It was unanimous. The court affirmed the lower court's decisions, holding that anencephalic infants are alive under Florida law and cannot be declared dead for the purposes of organ donation. But the opinion went further. It included a lengthy discussion of the medical and ethical issues, acknowledging the tragedy of cases like Teresa's while explaining why the court felt bound by existing law. We are not insensitive to the fact that an anencephalic infant's life is tragically brief, the opinion read. We are not insensitive to the desire of parents to find meaning in their child's death by allowing organ donation. But we cannot change the definition of death to accommodate even the most sympathetic circumstances. To do so would open questions and create ambiguities that could have dangerous consequences for all of society. The opinion concluded with a note that seemed directed at the legislature. If the people of Florida wish to change the legal definition of death to allow for anencephalic organ donation, that is a decision for the legislature to make, not the courts. The legislature never made that decision. Over the years, Laura gave several interviews about Teresa. She was always thoughtful, always measured, even when asked hostile or insensitive questions. In an interview she gave to a national magazine in 1995, she reflected on what she'd learned from the experience. "I don't regret trying," she said. "I know a lot of people think we were wrong, that we were trying to kill our baby or use her as spare parts, but that's not what it was. We loved Teresa. We wanted her life, as short as it was, to mean something. We wanted her death to save other babies." The interviewer asked if she'd do it again, knowing how it turned out. Laura was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she finally said. "The legal fight, the media attention, all of that, it was so hard. It took away from the time we had with Teresa. I wish we could have just focused on being her parents instead of fighting a battle we couldn't win. But at the same time, I'm glad we tried. I'm glad we stood up for what we believed in, even if we lost." She paused, then added, "I just wish the law was different. I wish there was a way for families in our situation to donate their babies' organs without all the legal obstacles. I think that would honor these babies, give their brief lives meaning. But I understand why people are scared of changing the law. I really do." Medical advances in the 3 decades since Teresa's death have been significant, but they haven't solved the core problem. Organ transplantation techniques have improved. Neonatal intensive care has gotten better. We can keep premature and critically ill babies alive longer than ever before. But anencephaly is still 100% fatal. There's still no treatment, no cure, no hope of survival. The condition is diagnosed earlier now, usually on ultrasounds between 11 and 14 weeks of pregnancy, which gives parents more time to make decisions about whether to continue or terminate the pregnancy. Most pregnancies diagnosed with anencephaly are terminated. The exact statistics vary by country and region. In the United States, it's estimated that about 75 to 90% of diagnosed anencephalic pregnancies end in abortion. For the parents who choose to carry to term, the outcome is the same as it was for Laura and Justin. The baby is born, lives for hours or days, and dies. And the organs cannot be donated. There have been isolated cases over the years where parents have attempted what Laura and Justin attempted. None have succeeded. In 1996, a couple in New Jersey tried to donate their anencephalic baby's organs. The courts ruled against them, citing the baby Teresa case as precedent. In 2003, a family in California petitioned for the same thing. Again, the court said no. In 2010, a family in Texas made the attempt. Same result. The law has not changed. The precedent set by baby Teresa's case stands. But the ethical debate continues, especially as medical technology advances in unexpected ways. In recent years, there have been experiments with artificial wombs, with growing organs in laboratories, with xenotransplantation, using animal organs in humans. These technologies might someday reduce the need for infant organ donors, might make cases like Teresa's less tragic because there would be other options for babies needing transplants. But we're not there yet. Babies still die waiting for organs, and anencephalic babies still die with perfectly healthy organs that could save them. The waste is heartbreaking. The ethical dilemma remains unresolved. Laura eventually remarried, had 2 healthy children. She doesn't talk about Teresa much anymore, but she thinks about her every day. There's a small memorial in her garden, a stone marker with Teresa's name, surrounded by white roses. On March 30th every year, the anniversary of Teresa's death, Laura takes the day off work. She goes to the cemetery, brings flowers, sits by the grave. Sometimes she talks to Teresa, tells her about her younger siblings, about how the world has changed since 1992. Sometimes she just sits in silence. Justin moved on too, though he never remarried. He still lives in Tampa, works construction, keeps to himself mostly. He doesn't talk about Teresa, doesn't give interviews, doesn't want to relive those 9 days. But he keeps a photo of her, the one photograph they took of all three of them together, in his wallet. It's faded now, worn at the edges from 20-some years of being carried around. But it's there. Some wounds never fully heal. Some losses never stop hurting. If you look up Baby Teresa today, you'll find dozens of academic articles, court documents, ethical analyses. The case is taught in medical schools as an example of the limits of brain death criteria. It's taught in law schools as an example of how courts handle unprecedented situations. It's taught in philosophy classes as an example of the tension between legal definitions and moral intuitions. But behind all the academic discussion, behind all the legal precedents and ethical arguments, was a real baby, a real family, real grief. That's what gets lost sometimes in these discussions. We talk about brain function and legal standards and slippery slopes, and we forget that we're talking about someone's daughter, someone's child who lived for 9 days and died, and whose parents just wanted her death to mean something. In the end, what do we take away from Baby Teresa's story? Maybe we take away the reminder that law and ethics don't always align perfectly, that there are situations where doing the right thing might not be the legal thing, and where following the law might not feel moral. Maybe we take away a deeper appreciation for how complex questions about life and death really are, that there are no easy answers, no simple solutions, no way to avoid difficult choices. Maybe we take away compassion for people facing impossible situations. Laura and Justin weren't heroes or villains. They were just parents who loved their daughter and wanted to find hope in tragedy. They deserved kindness, and instead they got judgment and controversy. Or maybe we take away the question itself, the question that Teresa's case forces us to confront. What makes a life valuable? Is it consciousness? Is it the capacity for experience? Is it simply biological function? Or is it something else entirely, something we can't quite define but we know when we see it? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're questions we all need to think about because medical technology keeps advancing, and we're going to face more cases like Teresa's. Different circumstances, different specifics, but the same fundamental dilemma. How do we balance respect for life with the reality of death? How do we honor the dying while trying to save the living? I don't have answers to these questions. I'm not sure anyone does, but I know that Teresa's life mattered. 9 days is not a long time, but it was her time. She was here, she was loved, and she changed the world, even if she never knew it. There's one more detail worth mentioning before I close the story. In the years after Teresa's death, several families who'd been through similar situations, families who'd had anencephalic babies, who'd considered organ donation, who'd faced the same legal obstacles, formed a support group. They called it Baby Teresa's Legacy. The group doesn't lobby for legal changes. They don't push for new legislation or court challenges. They just provide support for families going through what Laura and Justin went through. They offer someone to talk to, someone who understands, someone who's been there. Laura was involved with the group for several years in the late 1990s. She'd talk to newly diagnosed parents, answer their questions, help them think through their options. She'd explain what the legal situation was, what they could and couldn't do. And most importantly, she'd listen. "I can't change the law," Laura said once. "I can't bring Teresa back, but maybe I can help other parents feel less alone. Maybe that's enough." The group still exists today, though it's small and not widely known. It operates mostly online now, connecting families across the country who are facing these impossible choices. And in that way, Teresa's brief life continues to touch people, continues to matter, continues to make a difference. Maybe that's the meaning Laura and Justin were looking for all along. As I bring this story to a close, I want you to think about something. Teresa and Campo Pearson lived for 216 hours. That's 9 days. That's barely enough time to learn someone's name, to understand their personality, to know who they are. But in those 9 days, she became the center of a national debate. She challenged our understanding of life and death. She forced doctors, lawyers, ethicists, and ordinary people to ask hard questions about what we value and why. She never opened her eyes. She never knew her parents' names. She never experienced consciousness as we understand it. But she was here. She existed. She mattered. And maybe that's the real lesson of her story. Not the legal precedents or the ethical arguments, but the simple truth that every life, no matter how brief, no matter how limited, has value, has meaning, has dignity. Teresa's parents understood that. That's why they fought so hard, why they endured so much. Not because they saw their daughter as a collection of organs, but because they saw her as a person whose death could be meaningful, whose brief existence could have purpose. They were right. She did have purpose. Her story made us think, made us question, made us confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. That's no small legacy for 9 days of life. Thank you for listening. Thank you for spending this time with me, learning about Teresa and Laura and Justin and the impossible choice they faced. I hope you'll think about this story, not just the legal aspects or the ethical debates, but the human reality behind them. The mother who held her dying daughter and tried to find hope. The father who built a memory box for a child who would never grow up. The baby who lived for 9 days and changed the world. Their story matters. They matter. And maybe, in some small way, by remembering them, by telling their story, we're giving Teresa the meaning her parents so desperately wanted her to have. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our final story. Story 3. The Locked Door. The Unsolved Mystery of Nancy Benelak. On an October afternoon in 1973, a young legal secretary left work with plans for the evening ahead. She never made it home. What happened in the hours that followed would haunt San Francisco for decades, leaving behind a mystery so peculiar, so deeply unsettling, that even after an arrest was made, the questions refused to fade. This is the story of Nancy Benelak. Hello and welcome again. Get comfortable. Settle in. Tonight, we're traveling back to the early 1970s, to a city caught between eras, San Francisco, a place of fog and possibility, where the summer of love had given way to something darker, something less certain. This is a story about a young woman building a life, about an ordinary day that ended in the unthinkable, and about the thin line between safety and chaos, between routine and tragedy. It's a case that defied easy answers, that resisted the tidy conclusions we crave from true crime. Even now, all these years later, there are shadows in this story that won't quite lift. So breathe, let yourself drift, and let me tell you about Nancy. Nancy Marie Benelak was 27 years old in October of 1973. She had the kind of presence people remembered, intelligent, composed, warm without being effusive. She worked as a legal secretary at a law firm in downtown San Francisco, a job she took seriously and performed with quiet competence. Her colleagues liked her. She was reliable, professional, the kind of person you could count on. Nancy lived alone in a studio apartment on Guerrero Street, in a neighborhood that was ordinary in the way many San Francisco neighborhoods were at that time. Mixed, transitional, a patchwork of old Victorians and modest apartment buildings. The city itself was in flux. The idealism of the 60s had curdled into something more cynical. The Zodiac Killer had terrorized the Bay Area just a few years earlier. People were more cautious now, more aware, but life went on. People worked, paid rent, made plans. Nancy had plans. She was dating someone, though the relationship wasn't particularly serious. She had friends, a routine. She was thinking about the future in the way young people do. Abstractly, optimistically, assuming there would be time. She'd grown up in the Bay Area, Part of a close-knit family who valued education and hard work. Her parents had raised her to be independent, to take care of herself, to build a life on her own terms. And that's exactly what she was doing. The legal secretary position wasn't just a job, it was a career path. She was learning the ins and outs of law practice, considering whether she might want to go to law school herself someday. She had ambition, though she wore it quietly, without fanfare. Her apartment on Guerrero Street represented something important to her. Independence, adulthood, a space that was entirely hers. It wasn't large, studio apartments in San Francisco never are, but she'd made it comfortable. There were books on the shelves, plants on the windowsill, small touches that reflected her personality. She kept it clean and organized, the way she kept everything in her life. Order mattered to Nancy. Structure. Knowing where things belonged. October 10th, 1973, was a Wednesday. Nancy went to work that morning like always. She wore a dress, something neat and professional, the kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention but would signal she took her job seriously. She answered phones, typed letters, filed documents. The ordinary machinery of a law office in motion. The law firm where she worked was located in downtown San Francisco, in one of those buildings that housed dozens of small businesses, lawyers, accountants, insurance agents. The hallways smelled like coffee and old carpet. The elevators were slow. It was the kind of place where people said good morning to each other but didn't necessarily know each other's names. Around midday, she took a break. Maybe she stepped outside for air, or grabbed lunch at one of the nearby cafes. The details of her afternoon are mostly unremarkable, which is why they're so easy to forget. But they matter. They matter because they were her last normal hours. The last time the world made sense. Her coworkers would later recall that she seemed fine that day. Not upset, not worried, not distracted. Just Nancy doing her job, being her usual competent self. If something was bothering her, she didn't show it. She was good at that, keeping her private life private, maintaining that professional demeanor even when things weren't perfect. She left work at 5 in the evening. This is confirmed. Several co-workers saw her go. She seemed fine, maybe a little tired. Everyone's tired on a Wednesday, but nothing unusual. She carried her purse, a brown leather bag she'd had for years. She likely said goodbye, made some small talk about the evening ahead, mentioned something mundane like stopping by the store or relaxing at home. And then she was gone, disappearing into the flow of commuters heading home. Nancy's apartment was roughly a 20-minute walk from her office, or a short bus ride if she didn't feel like walking. We don't know exactly which route she took that evening, but we know she made it home, because that's where she was found. What we don't know, and what investigators would struggle with for years, is what happened after she unlocked her door. The building on Guerrero Street was nothing special. A modest structure, a little worn at the edges like most rental buildings in that part of the city. Nancy's studio was on an upper floor, small but private, a space she'd made her own. She kept it tidy, organized. It reflected the same quiet competence she brought to her work. Her neighbors were the usual mix. People who passed each other in the hallway, who nodded politely but didn't pry. San Francisco was like that. You could live next to someone for years and never know their story. Privacy was respected. Silence was common. The building had perhaps a dozen units, each one a self-contained world. People came and went. The front door locked automatically, a security measure that made residents feel safer, though of course no lock is perfect. No one heard anything unusual that night, or if they did, they didn't register it as significant. A door closing, footsteps, the ambient noise of an apartment building absorbing sound, muffling it, making it easy to ignore. Maybe someone heard raised voices, but dismissed it as a television or a domestic argument that wasn't their business. Maybe someone heard a thud, but assumed someone had dropped something heavy. These are the sounds of urban living, easy to rationalize, easier to ignore. When Nancy didn't show up for work the next morning, her coworkers were puzzled. It wasn't like her. She was the reliable one. She didn't miss work without calling. Something felt wrong, but in that vague way that makes you hesitate before acting. Maybe she was sick. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe she'd simply overslept and would show up any minute with an embarrassed apology. By midday on Thursday, October 11th, the concern had deepened. Someone from the office tried calling her apartment. No answer. They called again. Still nothing. The phone just rang and rang, that hollow sound that suggests emptiness on the other end. Finally, someone made the decision to check on her. It might have been a coworker. It might have been the building manager. The exact sequence is a little murky in the records, worn down by time and retellings. But someone went to her apartment. Someone knocked. No answer. They knocked again, harder this time, calling her name. Still nothing. The door was locked from the inside. There's a particular kind of dread that comes with that discovery. A locked door, no response, no good explanation. The decision was made to force entry. And when they did, when that door finally opened, they found Nancy. She was on the floor of her apartment. She'd been stabbed. Multiple times. The violence had been swift and brutal. The scene was chaotic. Evidence of a struggle, of panic, of something terrible unfolding in that small space. Nancy Benelak was dead, and the person who killed her was gone. The San Francisco Police Department responded immediately. Homicide detectives arrived within the hour, and the apartment became a crime scene. Yellow tape, cameras, the methodical work of collecting evidence. Officers secured the building, interviewed residents, began the painstaking process of documenting everything. The building was canvassed. Neighbors were interviewed. Had anyone seen anything? Heard anything? Most hadn't. A few remembered hearing sounds the night before. Maybe footsteps, maybe a door, but nothing that stood out. Nothing alarming enough to investigate. One neighbor thought they'd heard voices, but couldn't be sure. Another remembered hearing what might have been furniture moving, but that wasn't unusual in an apartment building. People rearranged things. It was normal. The locked door was significant. It suggested Nancy had been home, that she'd locked herself in, which is what you'd expect. But it also meant the killer had either left through the door and it had locked behind them, or they'd left another way. The apartment had windows, but they were several stories up. Not impossible, but difficult. Risky. Detectives examined the windows carefully. No signs of forced exit. No disturbance. The scene itself told a story, though not a clear one. Nancy had been attacked with a knife. The weapon wasn't found at the scene, which meant the killer had taken it with him. There were defensive wounds on Nancy's hands and arms, indicating she'd fought back. She hadn't gone quietly. She'd tried to survive. Her fingers showed cuts consistent with grabbing at a blade. Her forearms bore the marks of someone trying to protect themselves. The violence had been concentrated, focused. This wasn't a random, frenzied attack. It was deliberate. Someone had wanted Nancy dead. The number of wounds, investigators counted more than 20 stab wounds, suggested rage or determination or both. This was personal, they thought. It had to be. But why? Detectives started with the obvious questions. Who would want to hurt her? Did she have enemies? Was she involved in anything dangerous? The answers kept coming back negative. Nancy was, by all accounts, a quiet, private person. She didn't run in risky circles. She wasn't involved in anything criminal. She didn't owe money. She hadn't made threats or received them. Her life was, on the surface, unremarkable in the best possible way. Her personal life was examined. She'd been dating someone, a man whose name appears in some records but not others. He was interviewed immediately. He had an alibi. He'd been at work with multiple witnesses who could confirm his presence. He seemed genuinely shocked by Nancy's death, devastated even. Detectives cleared him quickly. Her co-workers were questioned. Friends, family, everyone painted the same picture. Nancy was kind, professional, someone who kept to herself but was always pleasant. She was someone who kept her life simple and her business private. She didn't gossip. She didn't create drama. She was, in many ways, the ideal employee, the ideal neighbor, the ideal friend. So who killed her? And how did they get into her apartment? The locked door suggested she'd let them in, that she knew them, or at least that she hadn't felt immediately threatened. But there was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had broken in. The most likely scenario was that Nancy had opened the door herself. She'd looked through the peephole or heard a knock and decided it was safe to open the door. Maybe it was someone she knew, a neighbor, a friend, someone who seemed safe, someone whose face she recognized, whose presence didn't trigger alarm. Or maybe it was someone she didn't know, but who had a reason to be there, a delivery person, a repair worker, someone with a plausible excuse to knock. In 1973, people were generally more trusting. The paranoia that would come later, the wariness about opening doors to strangers, hadn't fully set in yet. The investigators considered both possibilities. They looked into anyone who might have had access to the building. They checked records, interviewed maintenance staff, cross-referenced schedules. They spoke to delivery drivers who worked that route. They tracked down repairmen who'd been called to the building in recent weeks. Nothing jumped out. No one seemed suspicious. Then there was the physical evidence. Fingerprints were lifted from the apartment. Blood samples were taken. In 1973, forensic science was limited compared to today. DNA analysis didn't exist yet. There was no way to match blood or tissue to a specific person unless they were already in custody. Blood typing was possible, determining whether blood was type A, B, AB, or O, but that only narrowed the field so much. Still, the detectives did what they could. They cataloged everything. They hoped that someday, somehow, the pieces would fit together. They collected samples meticulously, stored them properly, documented everything. Maybe future technology would help. Maybe something would break. They looked at similar crimes in the area. Had there been other attacks? Other young women targeted? They found a few cases with superficial similarities, but nothing that clearly connected. This wasn't a serial offender, they concluded. This was something else. Days turned into weeks. The case stayed active, but leads dried up. Witnesses had nothing more to offer. The evidence didn't point to anyone specific. Nancy's murder became another file in a growing stack of unsolved homicides. San Francisco in the early 70s was a violent place. The city was grappling with a surge in crime. Robberies, assaults, murders. Resources were stretched thin. Detectives were juggling multiple cases at once. Nancy's case didn't close, but it didn't move forward either. It became one of those frustrating investigations where everything possible had been done, but nothing had worked. Her family buried her. They held a funeral, said goodbye, tried to process the incomprehensible. Her co-workers mourned her. The office felt emptier without her steady presence. The apartment on Guerrero Street was eventually cleaned and rented to someone else. Life went on the way it always does, even when it shouldn't. But Nancy's case didn't disappear. It stayed in the files. And every few years, someone would pull it out, look it over, wonder if maybe this time there'd be something new. Cold case detectives would review the evidence, re-interview witnesses if they could find them, check for any connections to other crimes. But year after year, nothing changed. The case remained cold. For 40 years, Nancy Benelak's murder remained unsolved. The file was reviewed periodically, whenever a detective had time or a new lead emerged, but nothing ever panned out. The case became a cold case, the kind that haunts departments, that detectives mention to each other late at night when the conversation turns philosophical. It became a teaching case, an example of how some crimes simply resist solution, no matter how hard you work them. The city changed around it. San Francisco transformed from the gritty, dangerous place of the 70s into something glossier, more expensive. Neighborhoods gentrified. The Castro became a tourist destination. The Mission filled with upscale restaurants. Technology arrived, first slowly, then all at once. The dot-com boom happened, then the crash, then the rise of social media companies. Real estate prices skyrocketed. The city became almost unrecognizable. The people who'd known Nancy grew older, moved away, passed on. Her parents eventually died, never knowing who killed their daughter. Some of her siblings remained in the area, but others scattered across the country. The world forgot her the way it forgets most victims. Her name disappeared from newspapers. Her story became a footnote, a statistic, one unsolved murder among thousands. But forensic science didn't stand still. By the 2000s, DNA analysis had become routine. Cold cases were being reopened across the country, evidence retested, matches found. The technology that hadn't existed in 1973 could now solve crimes decades old. Police departments started dedicating resources specifically to cold cases, forming special units that did nothing but review old evidence with new technology. In 2015, San Francisco cold case investigators decided to take another look at Nancy's case. It had been 42 years. Most of the original detectives were retired or dead. The city had changed completely, but the evidence, blood samples, swabs, anything that might contain DNA was still in storage, carefully preserved, waiting. Someone had done their job right all those years ago, storing the samples properly, maintaining the chain of custody. They sent it to a lab. Modern DNA extraction techniques could work with samples that would have been useless decades earlier. The technology had advanced dramatically. They could pull DNA from the tiniest amounts of biological material, from samples that had degraded over time. And they got a hit. The DNA matched someone in the system, a man named Richard Dwayne Ramirez. Not the infamous serial killer of the same name, but a different person entirely, someone whose DNA had been entered into the database years earlier for an unrelated offense. The match was solid, definitive, the kind of evidence that doesn't lie. Suddenly, after 42 years, Nancy's case had a suspect. Richard Ramirez had been living in the Bay Area in 1973. He was in his 20s at the time, roughly the same age as Nancy. But there was no obvious connection between them. They didn't work together. They weren't friends. They didn't move in the same social circles. As far as investigators could tell, they'd never met. So why had he killed her? The investigators dug into Ramirez's background. He had a criminal history, minor offenses, nothing violent, at least not on record. Some theft, some drug-related charges. The kind of petty criminality that doesn't usually escalate to murder. He'd moved around over the years, lived in different states, worked various jobs. By the time they identified him, he was an older man in his 70s, living quietly, unremarkably. He had a family, grandchildren, a normal life, or what appeared to be one. He was arrested in 2015 and charged with Nancy's murder. The DNA evidence was strong, definitive, really, placed him at the scene, in the apartment, in contact with Nancy. The probability of it being anyone else was astronomical, 1 in trillions or something similarly absurd. This was him. But DNA can tell you who, not why. And Ramirez wasn't talking. He maintained his innocence, refused to explain, refused to confess. His lawyers argued that the DNA evidence, while compelling, didn't prove murder. Maybe he'd been in the apartment for some other reason. Maybe there was a misunderstanding, a coincidence. Maybe he'd known Nancy in some capacity they couldn't trace, had visited her apartment innocently, and someone else had killed her later. It was a weak argument, but it was all they had. The prosecution disagreed. They built their case around the physical evidence, the violence of the crime, the absence of any other explanation. Nancy had been brutally murdered. Ramirez's DNA was there, mixed with hers in ways that suggested intimate contact, violent contact. The math was simple. The conclusion was unavoidable. The media picked up the story. After 42 years, Nancy's name was in the papers again. Her family spoke to reporters, expressing relief that someone had finally been identified, but also frustration that it had taken so long. Some of them were angry, others were just tired. Everyone wanted answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. The trial was set. Prosecutors prepared their case. Defense attorneys looked for weaknesses. Witnesses were lined up. Expert testimony was arranged. It would be a high-profile case, they knew. A 42-year-old murder solved by DNA. The kind of story people loved. And then, before it could begin, Richard Ramirez died. He was 70 years old. Natural causes, apparently. A heart attack or something similar. The kind of death that arrives quietly, without drama. One day he was in jail awaiting trial, and the next day he was gone. And just like that, the case was closed. Not solved exactly, but concluded. The official record would show that Nancy's killer had been identified. But there would be no trial, no verdict, no confession, no opportunity for the family to confront him, to hear him explain, to see justice actually done in a courtroom. No answers. Nancy Benelak was murdered on an October evening in 1973. She was 27 years old. She had a job, friends, a life she was building. And then, in the space of minutes, all of it was taken. She became a statistic, a case number, a story told late at night to help people fall asleep. For 42 years, no one knew who killed her. And now, more than 50 years later, we have a name. Richard Ramirez. A man who lived and died without ever explaining why. A man who, if the DNA is to be believed, ended Nancy's life for reasons we'll never understand. The questions linger. How did he get into her apartment? Did she know him? Did she open the door willingly? Or was there some other way in? What brought him to Guerrero Street that night? Was it random, or was Nancy targeted? Had he seen her before, followed her, waited for an opportunity? Or was it pure chance? A terrible coincidence? Wrong place, wrong time? We'll never know. And maybe that's the hardest part. Not the violence itself, though that's terrible enough, but the absence of meaning. The refusal of the universe to offer a tidy explanation. We want our stories to make sense. We want clear motives, understandable reasons, a narrative that follows logic. But real life rarely cooperates. Nancy's family waited decades for answers. Some of them are gone now, having died without ever seeing justice. Those who remain had to settle for a name and a closed file. It's not nothing, but it's not enough. They never got to face him in court. They never got to hear him explain himself, even if that explanation would have been inadequate or false. They never got that moment of confrontation that victims' families often say provides closure, though whether such closure really exists is debatable. The apartment where she died is still there. The building on Guerrero Street stands as it always has, a little more weathered now, but essentially unchanged. Someone else lives in Nancy's studio now. They probably don't know what happened there. Or maybe they do, and they've made peace with it, the way people make peace with living in a city full of ghosts. San Francisco is like that. Every building has a story. Some are happy, some aren't. The neighborhood has changed dramatically. Guerrero Street is expensive now, desirable. The rough edges have been smoothed over. The people who live there now are young professionals, tech workers, artists who can somehow afford the rent. Safe, or as safe as any urban neighborhood can be. The old fears have been replaced by new ones. San Francisco has changed. The fog still rolls in, but the streets are different. Safer, maybe, or just different kinds of dangerous. The random street violence of the 70s has given way to organized crime, to property theft, to the low-level chaos of a city that can't quite figure out how to house everyone. But murder rates are down. Women can walk home from work without the same level of fear. Progress of a sort. True crime stories often end with closure, conviction, a sentence, a sense that the world has been set right, even if only partially. But not all stories end that way. Some just stop. The questions remain. The victim stays dead. And the rest of us are left to wonder. Nancy Benelak deserved better. She deserved to grow old. To have children, maybe. To see the new century. To watch the internet arrive, to get a cell phone, to marvel at how much the world changed. To retire, to travel, to enjoy her grandchildren if she'd had any. To live. Instead, she got an October evening. A knock on the door. A few minutes of terror. And then silence. Her case is officially closed. But in a way, it will never be closed. Because we'll never really know. We'll never understand what happened in that apartment. We'll never hear the full story from the person who ended her life. We'll never know if he targeted her specifically or if she was simply unlucky. We'll never know if he felt remorse or if he forgot about her the next day, moving on with his life while hers was over. These are the questions that haunt cold cases. the ambiguity, the incompleteness, the sense that justice, even when it arrives incomplete. Prosecutors can tell you they solved the case. They can point to the DNA match, to the scientific certainty. But solving a case isn't the same as understanding it. And understanding might be what we need most. Nancy's name is remembered now, at least for a while. This story will be told, listened to, maybe discussed in online forums where true crime enthusiasts gather. People will speculate about what really happened. They'll offer theories, analyze the timeline, debate the evidence. And then, eventually, they'll move on to the next case, the next mystery, the next story. And so, Nancy remains, not just as a victim, but as a question. A reminder that the world is not always knowable. That some things resist explanation. That even when we find the who, we might never find the why. That closure is sometimes an illusion we tell ourselves to make the unbearable bearable. The fog still rolls into San Francisco. The city still sleeps and wakes and goes about its business. Buildings still stand where terrible things once happened. And people still tell stories about the past, hoping maybe that the telling itself serves some purpose. That remembering matters. That saying someone's name keeps them, in some small way, alive. Rest now. Let the story settle. And remember Nancy not for how she died, but for the fact that she lived. That she mattered. That she was here. That she was 27 years old and had her whole life ahead of her. That she was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's colleague. That she was a person, not just a victim, not just a case file, not just a story. And that even in the darkest stories, there's a kind of light in remembering. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.